Hello and welcome along to our sixth episode of What the Israeli Papers Say on our Real Israel YouTube channel. I'm Paul Alster, a broadcast journalist based here in Israel. Now, to stay in touch with all editions of this show, do remember to press the red subscribe button just below this screen. And also as well, remember to follow us on Twitter. We're tweeting as well, not like some people all the way through the night, but we do tweet fairly regularly, and our handle is real_Israel. Now, my two guest reviewers this week, I'm delighted to say, are Rabbi Seth Farber and Rabbi Yishai Fleisher. Rabbi Seth Farber, who lives in Ra'anana in central Israel, he is an American-Israeli modern Orthodox rabbi. He's a historian and the founder and director of the Jewish Life Advocacy organization ITIM. In 2018, he received an Israeli Ministry of Aliyah and Integration Award for his outstanding contribution to Israeli society. So, Rabbi Farber, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
And also with us, I'm delighted to say, Rabbi Yishai Fleisher, who is the international spokesperson for the Jewish community of Hebron, and he has a weekly podcast on the Land of Israel network. Rabbi Fleisher is a former IDF paratrooper. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Well, it's lovely to have you guys here with us. Up until now, our first 5 programs have been with mainly journalists and mainly secular. So it's interesting to present different perspectives on the news here in Israel, because our whole raison d'etre, you might say, is to look at news stories here that aren't always covered in detail by the mainstream media. And it's great to have you with us looking at these different issues. Now, obviously, at the time of recording, here on Thursday, the 5th of November, we still don't know the outcome of the US election, which is, of course, is keeping everybody around the world very much entranced to some degree. Now, Yishai Fleisher, you were very interested in speaking to us, first of all, about a piece that's been in the news. It's been covered by a number of different outlets here, including the JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate, Haaretz, Israel Today, images of which you'll see on the screen very shortly. And this is to do with the fact that Jewish settlers have been praying for Trump to be re-elected. Tell us a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, I think that first thing, before we talk about Trump, that sounds very much like a person, but really we're talking about an administration and a set of policies that have benefited us. And the reason I make that distinction is because it's very easy to just turn it into a cult of personality, but it's not. It's not about motorcycles, and it's not about flags. It's really about policies that make a huge difference for us. And for us in Judea and Samaria, and I think for many Israelis, certainly over half of Israelis, believe that President Trump and his administration have been good for Israel, and that really is a large group of policy decisions that this administration has made, including pushing back on Iran, including recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and the sovereign part of Israel, also including the recognition of Judea and Samaria is legal under international law, according to the United States understanding of that. That was a big move. And then for me, I was involved with, personally, I was involved with the issue of UNESCO. UNESCO is the UN organization that recognizes World Heritage Sites. Yes. And we had a situation in which UNESCO was coming to the decision that the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs in Hebron, where I work, is actually a Palestinian World Heritage Site. Now, that was very bothersome to us, since it was a Jewish king 2,000 years ago who built the monumental building on top of the site, and it's the famed site of the founders, the first family of the Jewish people, the founders of the Israeli biblical family. So to us, that decision was shocking, and we made a fight, and it was the Trump administration which recognized the inherent anti-Semitism of erasing Israeli and Jewish history and pulled out of UNESCO specifically because of their anti-Hebron site. And I had a lot to do with that decision, and so I was amazed, really, that we were dealing with an administration that saw eye to eye on so many issues that were important to us, important to Israeli defense and important to Jewish rights in the land of Israel. And it was really so refreshing these last 4 years to not have an American administration that was tacitly paying money to terrorists or tacitly supporting Iran, or really protecting us a little bit at the UN, but allowing a lot of anti-Israelism at the United Nations. So we were praying. We did a kind of a unheard of thing. We prayed for the success of one administration at the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs, which is a holy shrine.
Is there a specific prayer for this happening?
Well, let's not get too locked into certain rites and rituals. We used a prayer that is called the Mishaberach prayer, and we added some words to it. But a prayer is a prayer. It doesn't need formality. It doesn't need pomp and circumstance. It needs to call out to the Creator and say, hey, this has been something that we think has been good for the Jews, good for Israel, and also, by the way, let me add, we very much believe that this has been very good for the region. And the Abraham Accords, which have been signed with our regional friends and allies, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and others, we think have a tremendous impact on this region. And we came also to the Tomb of Abraham, which is in Hebron, to celebrate the success of the Abraham Accords and to really look forward to a growing new Middle East that was going to come through the continuation of this process.
It's certainly a map that's changing, and we've been touching on this over recent weeks with all the progress that's been made with the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and hopefully others. Rabbi Farber, I want to come to you as far as your view on the American election and on Donald Trump. Is it essential in your view that he is re-elected as president of the US, or do you believe that whoever is in power, there'll be somebody that we can work with here in Israel?
I'm a big firm believer that we need to get beyond the politics of divisiveness. And unfortunately, while I think, and I have a tremendous amount of positive feeling for some of the acts that the administration did, the Trump administration did during the last 4 years that support Israel, particularly the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, I think that the partisanship that was created, and particularly the divisiveness that so much has characterized American society, and now American Jewish society, and now Israeli Jewish society, I think that has no place in democracy or a democratic era. And what I'd like to believe is that whoever is elected president will work hard, very hard, to bring things back to a place where we're all talking to each other and there isn't so much hatred in the world. I think part of the vision of the patriarchs, I think what Hebron represents, I think what the Jewish state is meant to represent is accord, not disaccord. And unfortunately, and I don't know whose fault it is, and it's not my position to blame anybody, but I don't think anybody could argue that right now we're seeing in front of us a tremendous amount of fighting and infighting, particularly in American society, but also in Israeli society about these issues. And I'm hopeful, whoever the president is, they will work to bring us together as a human family. And that the Jewish community will recognize that despite some of the differences, however you voted and whoever you voted for, we certainly share a lot more in terms of our destiny together than what's coming to the fore today.
Well, if I could just comment on that, Paul, for a second.
Of course.
I think that Rabbi Farber is saying something that's very true, and I really agree with wholeheartedly that we need to come back to a place of interhuman dialogue, not only just in America, but around the world. The divisiveness has become really a scourge. And I think that the enemies of America are gloating today, no matter who wins president, because they have really managed to see America become a divided country. And those people who are into kind of subterfuge and sabotage and want to see a weaker America are indeed happy today. And I also agree with Rabbi Farber that Hebron, it really represents coming together. The word itself means friendship and togetherness. And we have there women and men, the fathers and mothers coming together. We have Isaac and Ishmael coming together there to bury their mutual father, Abraham. At the same time, I don't think we can look away from realpolitik. And to me, and to people that I work with and represent, a President Biden is in the end part of what was previously known as Obama Biden. So, the Biden-Harris ticket really is on the same lines. And we had 8 years of President Obama's policies, which we really struggled amiably through, but it was a tough time policy-wise. And so I think that we also, though I agree with the sentiment, I think that, my realpolitik side says to me, if we get a President Biden, we will be struggling through it.
Well, we'll find out very soon, hopefully, when those votes are all counted and legal challenges aside, who is going to be leading America going forward. I just want to put a point to the two of you, actually, because it's something that cropped up in last week's conversation that I had relating to President Trump. And it's the question of whether or not his support of Israel is based on a belief in Israel and a genuine support of the Jewish nation, or whether it's a political stance on his part because of his need to have the Christian evangelist vote on side, many of whom are very fervent supporters of Israel. Do you believe that much of what he's doing is to please the Christian evangelists, and maybe if he does get a second term, that he might not be quite as dedicated to the cause as some people think? I'll come to Rabbi Farber first on that.
So I don't know what drives the current administration or the previous administration precisely. What I can say is that I think it's a commonplace at this point, and a correct one, that it's in America's strategic interests to support Israel. And I'm not sure substantively the support has been better or worse under any of the last 5 presidents. And really, I think history will judge that Obama was very favorable to Israel and Trump was very favorable to Israel, and neither one because they particularly loved Israel over Somalia, Venezuela, or London, but primarily because it's in America's strategic interest to be supportive of Israel. Whether support of Israel manifests itself in a more stick policy towards what they would call the settler movement, or a carrot policy towards the settler movement, I think in the end it doesn't have so much to do, or only to do, with political interests. I think it has to do with America's strategic interests. Mm-hmm. So I think in the end, again, I know individuals, Rabbi Fleisher mentioned they felt they suffered under Obama, and they were more, their community was more, received more benefits through the Trump administration. I'm sure there are other communities in Israel, I can name a few, that felt that under the Obama administration, there were things that were going on better. And again, who's to say? Who's to say whether a deal with Iran was better or worse, or who pulls back and who pulled back? Again, in the end, I could tell you I was very uncomfortable with the deal with Iran, but I'm also uncomfortable with not having any dialogue with Iran, and Iran just being left to do whatever the heck they want to do. So, But I think in the end, I think it's in America's strategic interest. And like I said, I'd like to believe that if the next president is Biden, or if the next president is Trump, whoever it is, they will also, for American strategic reasons, have a very, very strong affinity to help Israel and to want to push Israel forward and to make Israel as a project work.
Well, last word on this one to Yishai Fleisher, as regards the support from the Christian evangelical community as well on this issue.
I think that President Trump's relationship to Israel comes really from 3 places. One is the one you've mentioned, the evangelical community, and pleasing your voters is actually called democracy, so there's nothing wrong with that, doing what your voters elected you to do, so that's good. But I think it also comes from 2 more places. One, which is never mentioned in the media, but is actually a real thing, which is President Trump is a New Yorker. And as a New Yorker, he in many ways was involved in a lot of business with Jews and a lot of just, daily connection to Jewish people. I know a lot of Jewish business people who know him personally and have had dealings with him. And growing up in this kind of developing in this great city called New York, it's very much a Jewish city. So he very much, grew with that consciousness of these people and their way of thinking. And thirdly, I think that he has just a rationalist approach to statecraft and wants to see a strong Israel as an ally that he empowers in our region as like the kind of regional sheriff, which is maybe outsource or be the defense contractor of this region to Israel, which is really probably the strongest military in our region. And other actors, I think that he saw, unlike the Obama administration, as inherently dangerous. If it's the Iranian mullah regime are suing for a nuclear bomb, or if it's the Muslim Brotherhood, which President Obama showed favor to, especially in Egypt when Morsi took over. And also, I just want to remind everybody that when Vice President Biden came to town, there happened to be an announcement that an area in Jerusalem was going to be developed called Ramat Yishai. Ramat Yishai. In any case, a neighborhood that's really a normative part of Jerusalem. And President Biden made a press conference. Vice President Biden made a press conference to make sure that it would be publicly known that he's berating Prime Minister Netanyahu for announcing the development of parts of Jerusalem. So I think that I think we can't well wish it all away. I think that there's differences in policy. Sure, it's in America's strategic interest, but strategic interests are understood differently by different players. Some people are more towards the globalist Euro type of approach, and other people are more towards nationalism and conservatism. These are fundamentally different approaches, and they're not going to be bridged easily by everybody having generally same feeling. They don't. And vis-a-vis creation of Palestine as well. The Obama administration, the Biden folks, they are very much for a Palestine in Judea and Samaria. The Trump administration, much more cautious about that. Their plan very much hemming in the terrorism aspect of Palestinian Authority, which I remind you pays about $400 million a year to people who've murdered Jews. So I think there is a more distinct difference. And I think if we get a new president, we'll indeed feel it.
Well, we'll know soon, won't we, once those votes are all counted and, as I say, legal challenges aside. So that's our first story, which has been very broadly covered, the prayers for Trump, and, of course, all the Israeli media completely hooked on what's going on in Israel, in America at the moment. I want to move on to a second story, which we are featuring one or two images from the front pages of the Jerusalem Post and the Times of Israel. And Rabbi Farber, this is a case that's been ongoing, as I understand it, since August, through the High Court had given the rabbinate 90 days to find a solution to women's halacha exams. Now, 90 days by my counting means somewhere around where we are now. And I know this is a case you're very closely involved in. So would you explain to our viewers, first of all, what the case is about, and secondly, what your role is in bringing this case and what you expect to happen?
Sure. So Israel has a very complex relationship between synagogue and state. And in fact, rabbinic ordination to become a rabbi in Israel, that's something that's coordinated by the state of Israel. And it comes with all sorts of benefits. You take a certain set of exams in order to prepare yourself for being a rabbi. And then I can simplify it by saying it's basically the equivalent of a university degree. It takes that amount of time. You take those exams. And it provides all sorts of benefits in terms of employment if you want to work for the government, etc. Mm-hmm. The Orthodox community, and I'm an Orthodox rabbi, is going through, like the rest of the world, a certain sense of modernization. And with that, the question of what happens when women are equally qualified as men to serve in certain positions, or not even to serve in certain positions, but to have those exams administered to them. You may be familiar that Israel has rabbinical courts that are, of course, in charge of marriage and divorce in Israel. And Muslims have a similar thing in Israel called the Sharia courts. The Sharia courts actually have a woman judge who serves in the Sharia courts itself. Now, as an Orthodox rabbi, I'll be very honest and say the jury is still out about what will happen in another 50 or 100 years, the extent to which women can serve in certain positions. But in the meantime, there's been an enormous revolution that's gone on in terms of women's access to Jewish sources in the last 30 or 40 years. And because of that, we have now in Israel, not tens, not hundreds, thousands of women who are studying rabbinic sources, biblical sources, Jewish legal sources, but they have no way of becoming accredited, no formal way of becoming accredited to have their, and thus being recognized to get the benefits of having studied that material and passed exams. The organization I run, ITIM, sees this as a positive development within the Jewish community. And we've petitioned the rabbinate on a number of occasions, and I want to be very clear here, not to ordain women, We feel that's still an issue that has
Okay.
to be decided in a very broad context, and it needs consensus, and we're not pushing for that. What we're anxious to do, and as you said, last August we actually filed a suit in the Supreme Court, what we're anxious to do is have the state of Israel issue a set of certifications for women that's parallel to those of men, particularly because there are financial incentives, not just financial, but there's psychological and sociological advantages to having passed or being certified by the state of Israel in these exams. This is a dramatic moment in the history of the Jewish people. Never before has an international governmental body issued these kinds of exams towards women. In fact, Israel itself is a dramatic project in the sense that we're trying to find a methodology that integrates 2,000 plus years of Jewish tradition with a modern democratic state. And one of the areas it manifests itself in is what is religious leadership. So it's hard. You'll find here and there women rabbis, but we have now incredible amounts of women scholars, right? Thousands of them that have no avenue of access to get the same benefits as men. And because of that, eventually we ended up in the courts. You ask about the 90 days, Paul. Let me just address that for a moment.
Yes.
Legal cases everywhere, especially during the era of COVID-19, they certainly take a long time. The rabbinate actually has not been totally opposed to the notion of recognizing women's achievements in Jewish rabbinic literature. But they haven't made a formal offer. In fact, just this week, in the last day or two, we heard from the Supreme Court that there's going to be a hearing about it because the rabbinate's offers that they offered in court never appeared on our table, on ITIM's table, as a formal offer. And because of that, we'd like to settle. We'd like to come up with a methodology that we don't have to sue. For ITIM, we're very anxious not to go to court. We are very anxious to see a religious establishment in Israel that's more inclusive and that is more accepting, that's more modern, that's more in tune with where the Israeli citizenship is, and more importantly, where the Jewish world is. And right now, the Chief Rabbinate is a fundamentally political organization, and it services a very, very thin slice of the Jewish people. So this is a good example of one of the things that ITIM does in order to try to change things on the ground.
Okay. So you set the context of what this whole case is about and what the issues are at stake. Yishai Fleisher, your view on this as far as women becoming more involved in this sphere and on whether or not the rabbinate is representing only a small slice, as Rabbi Farber said, of the Jewish experience as a whole.
You know, Paul, when you invited me on the show, I said to you that Rabbi Farber's articles are very interesting, but they're not exactly the field that I argue or feel passionate about. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm listening to Rabbi Farber, I think it's very interesting what he's saying. I come up with some questions, but they're not opinions. They're questions of what he pointed out, which is the state of Israel is a secular, modern state. It's dealing with texts and with religious decisions of the last really 3,000 years that are religious in nature. Last time that we had a Jewish national / religious state, an ethnic national state, the way we have today, it's been a long time. We barely have any laws on the books about how a Jewish state, a state that's Jewish, is supposed to operate. Mm-hmm. And so these things are coming into conflict. And we also have values of modernity. I'll give you an example. We bless our sons and daughters Friday night. Fathers and mothers bless their children. Now, the way we bless the boys is we say, Yasimcha Elokim k'Ephraim u'kemenashe. May God bless you like Ephraim and Menashe. For the girls, and that's a verse that's in the Bible, but there wasn't such a verse for girls. Mm-hmm. And somewhere along the line, it was added into the prayer book, the words Yasimcha Elokim k'Sarah Rivka Chevaya, that God should put you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And they added that because it was only fair to now be able to bless the daughters in that way. But that wasn't a biblical verse, so somebody had to come up with it. So it's clear that there are times where the issues of equality, of healthy feminism, I use that word because I don't want to just use the word feminism, because sometimes that is also linked up with a kind of Marxist feminism that happens sometimes on American campuses and different places where it becomes a cudgel to strike against. So Rabbi Farber is part of an organization, I think, that tries to straddle orthodoxy and modernity, and is the very title that you used for him, which is Modern Orthodox. But that means that there's two things to straddle. There are sometimes efforts to try to use a modern element to start calling Judaism a patriarchy and to strike it down. And I have a friend who teaches at a liberal institution that was considering leaving the place because he started feeling that it wasn't being true to the traditions and to our godly given Torah. So last point, which is in this very Torah portion that we're reading this Shabbat Vayera, we see that Abraham is going to argue with God. He's going to argue with God should Sodom be destroyed. I think that Abraham is like the first liberal. Here he is arguing for Sodom, and I respect that, and that's there to teach you. Wow, like he stands up to God and says, make sure that you're doing justice. But then you have another side in this Torah portion, which is Sarah, and she says, Ishmael, he cannot grow up together with my son Isaac. It'll be destructive. I want separation. I want Ishmael to go away, which is like very harsh, and it's hard for Abraham. So these are tensions that are in our tradition, in our Bible, and I don't have a specific comment on this issue, other than that it's very interesting, and as long as people like Rabbi Farber do it with faithfulness to our tradition, and at the same time an interest in making the state of Israel a strong and successful incorporated Jewish state, then I wish them lots of luck.
So thanks for that. Essentially, Rabbi Farber, what Rabbi Fleisher is saying is that what you're doing is following a very long line of tradition of questioning the status quo and having the subject debated, and that's what your organization is all about, trying to put things in a modern context and make things work for the Jewish people today.
It's not enough for us to question. We feel that this is a moment in Jewish history that's transformational, and the decisions that are made today will have implications, much broader implications for the future of the Jewish people, not just the Jewish state. I go around the world lecturing, and people always say, what do you think, at the end, I often get this question, what do you think about the fact that Israel is 72 years old? How are we doing? And my first reaction is always, Israel is not 72 years old. Israel is 72 years young. And because of that, Israel is really just at the beginning of something dramatic that we don't even know the implications of yet. We're still living on the heels of the greatest tragedy in thousands of years for our people, and the greatest miracle for our people. And as a people, and not just as a people, but as a lone democracy in a region that isn't as friendly as maybe we would like it to be, we have a great responsibility, not just to throw out our traditions, but to incorporate our traditions into a modern context. So a lot of the issues that ITIM deals with are not just to raise the questions. We're not a think tank. We're an activism institution, and what we're interested in doing is being transformational. We're interested in shaping the future of the state of Israel and the Jewish people.
And do you expect to get a positive outcome from this case? What's your gut feeling about what decision is going to be reached on this?
Look, we already had one hearing in the Supreme Court. It's somewhat ironic. I assume it's not lost on the people who are participating and watching and listening to us that here I am, an Orthodox rabbi. I'm not a lawyer, and I find myself in the Supreme Court more than my share, arguing these cases about the state of Israel, and I do it out of motivations of Zionism and commitment to the future of the Jewish people. In the first hearing that we had, there was an indication that the state recognizes that there's a problem here.
Yes.
And that the rabbinate's attitude, which is, let's just, to some extent, and again, I say this a little tongue-in-cheek, but to basically put our heads in the sand, but the rabbinate's attitude that we don't need to respond to these issues at all doesn't take into account the civil dimensions of what these exams are about. So I feel very positive about where things are going, and I feel like we're doing a service not just to the thousands of women today, but we're doing a service to the Jewish people for the long term, where women will have equal access, not just to our tradition and to rabbinic sources, but equal access to the, I don't like to call them benefits, but more to the certifications that come along with that access. So I really feel this is really a bigger story. It's a bigger narrative about what the state of Israel is about. Like I said, the project of the state of Israel, this is the greatest lab of the Jewish people in 2,000 years, and we're just at the beginning of it.
Well, again, this is another one that we're going to be waiting on for the results to come through. And I, for one, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers will be watching with a lot of interest and keeping an eye on your organization. But just your organization has your website, just so that if they want to follow the developments.
Yeah, our organization is called ITIM, I as in Israel, TIM, ITIM, which means times or seasons. Has to do with the moments in which people interact with the institutions of religious life in Israel. And our website is itim.org.il. And you can follow us on Facebook, and you can follow us on Twitter, etc. But please feel free to visit our website.
Okay, it is a very big issue, and it deserves people's attention. I'm going to move on to another issue now that Rabbi Fleisher has raised as a point that he'd like to discuss here, because it also relates to the US elections to a degree, in that just before the election took place, there was an issue, a permit being issued for some new buildings to go up in the Hebron area, which Rabbi Yishai Fleisher comes from and that he speaks on behalf of. And this is a story that's been reported quite widely, not just here in Israel, but internationally as well. Among the local press, there's been big stories in the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, Ynet, Yediot Achronot's online version. And I'd like you to explain, Rabbi Fleisher, a little bit about why it was so important to try and get these permits before the election, bearing in mind that a lot of people are aware that Hebron is in Judea and Samaria, what's known internationally as the West Bank, and that for a lot of people it would be seen as quite of a provocative action. Why was it so important, you feel, for these permits to be issued?
Well, first thing, I liked what Rabbi Farber said, that we're not a think tank, we're an activist entity, and so too the Jewish community of Hebron and the movement of attaining sovereignty for Jewish people in Judea and Samaria is very much an activist movement. Has a thought outside, but it's trying to achieve a political goal, and that political goal is the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty and Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria, which is really the heartland of our people. That's where Jewish history comes from. And if Zionism is based on coming back to that ancient land that we lived and worked in beforehand and thrived in, this is where our culture is from, that the heartland of that history is actually in places like Bethel, Beit El, and Shiloh, and Shechem, and what's called today Eastern Jerusalem, which is where the Temple Mount stands, and the Mount of Olives, and Bethlehem, and of course Hebron, which has in it a shrine which speaks of our people's long past in this place, 3,800 years, and really indigenous. So the people that don't want Jewish presence, they use a term called occupation. And occupation really means that you're a foreigner in this land. You're not a native. You're not from here. You're both an outsider and therefore necessarily an abuser, because if you're an outside controlling somebody else's land, you're necessarily an abuser. So we have fought that with the idea that we're indigenous. We have fought the idea of a two-state solution with the idea of Israeli sovereignty. And we have fought the word occupation, I think, now with an amazing word, which is the Abraham Accords.
When you say we, do you just would you clarify who we is when you're referring to this issue?
We are basically nationalist Jews. They're oftentimes voters for the Likud, for the nationalist so-called right-wing parties that stand together on this issue. And we, more specifically, as the Jewish community of Hebron, which is the most ancient Jewish community in the land of Israel, and has really existed pretty much straight for the last 2,000 years, with a few little breaks when the Crusaders came along, and also after the horrific 1929 jihadist massacre that killed 67 Jews. The Jews of Hebron were expelled by the British. It's not your fault, Paul. I'm not going to hold you to it.
I wasn't involved in that one.
Right, that's right. I'll give you a pass.
Yeah.
But in any case, we are now in the process of rebuilding the Jewish community, reacquiring lands that were taken from us in a forcible fashion, a violent fashion in 1929. We're still fighting just to get back to the property that we owned in 1929.
And the the number of people, of Jewish people in Hebron compared to the number of Arab Palestinians, the ratio is about 200 to 1. Am I correct? That there's just over 1,000
let's talk in straight numbers.
200,000 Palestinians?
Well, there's about 1,000 Jews that live in Hebron, and settlers is a fine word. It's okay, but it
just
comes
as a
with
broad definition, so everybody can understand who we're speaking about. Yeah.
Well, that's right. But even though that word itself has in it it's not a definitional term. It's also a term that carries with it political weight. Just like pro-life and pro-choice are not just words that mean what they mean; they actually mean something else. So the Jewish community of Hebron numbers about 1,000 Jews, but we have a sister community right next door, which is Kiryat Arba, has 9,000 Jews. That's about 10,000 Jews and around 200,000 Arabs. But to put the Arabs into one category is a great misnomer. Okay, many of the Arabs that we deal with, including the whole Jabri clan, which is about 40,000 people, are very much against the Palestinian Authority, against the repression that they suffer under the Palestinian Authority, and against the jihadism, the anti-Israel hate of the Palestinian Authority. So to put the Arabs into one group and the Jews into another group is really not true. We have a thugocracy. That's a term that's out there on the internet.
What was the word? A
thugocracy, right?
Okay,
right.
That's a new word for my lexicon. Okay, I'm glad we've all got together today. That's a new word for me. Okay, just to come to the point though, because we're limited to time, and obviously the complexities are great. I think we all understand. I hope people understand how complex it is. And as we keep making out on this channel, it's not just about black and white. People too often want to see things black or white. There are so many shades of grey in every issue that a lot of people and a lot of media don't always tend to look into. But I want to ask you specifically about this permit for the 31 buildings. Why was it so important to get it done before the election?
Right. So in the 1800s, that property was purchased. It's called the Rova Chizkiah, the Chizkiah property. It was purchased in the 1800s. It passed to a very righteous rabbi, and from there it actually was purchased by the Chabad dynasty, the Chabad Lubavitch dynasty. That's who owns it till this very day. And then it was kind of taken away in 1929 in these riots, and yet Chabad kept pushing and saying, "We own this property. We own this property." Actually, let me. I just made a little mistake. I want to make it clear. Actually, the property was taken away already by the Turkish authorities during the beginnings of World War I. Chabad were Russian Jews, and Russia was on the other side of the war with Turkey in World War I. So they expropriated the property from Chabad because they were Russians in already 1914. In 1929, in the riots, it kept on being kept out of our hands. It became a Jordanian police station, and then the British didn't return it either. And then under Israel, it was kind of kept boarded up. But Chabad and others kept saying, this is our property. We finally got the right to build this. Now we got permits to build this thing. And the Peace Now, representing some of the Arabs, took us to Supreme Court. Now we were saying, wait a minute, we have every right to build this property. This is our land. This is here's our registration. Everybody knows it. And what happened was that through a normative political pressure, we were able to get the civil administration, which is the kind of quasi-government that runs Judea and Samaria, to give us a permit to build, notwithstanding the Supreme Court case, meaning to say, you have a permit to build until the Supreme Court releases it, which they probably will, and then you could build immediately. Okay? Now, Peace Now made that into a story as though this was all about the American elections. It was more coincidental, in truth, than anything about the American elections. However, to answer your question even more specifically, there's no question that the American administration, the Trump administration, was more friendly to the idea of Jewish people living in Judea and Samaria, as was clearly voiced in the Pompeo Doctrine, which recognized Jewish rights in Judea and Samaria.
Clearly
so
they would support
the Greece, went all the way down, and it made projects like building Jewish Hebron happen more easily throughout the whole Israeli governmental mechanism. So it is important, of course, at this time to try to get those permits as quick as possible and to be able to actually build.
Okay, so it's a hugely complex issue. This, I want to just ask Rabbi Seth Farber your view on this. Do you feel it was purely coincidental, and is it something that sits comfortably with you and people from your particular viewpoint? How would you assess what's happened with regards to the building permits and the ongoing dispute on these issues?
I think I'd rather address the ongoing dispute rather than the specific building permits. I think the issue is a question of timing. It's all that. Or it's sometimes there's times that are better to engage in these activities, and sometimes there are times that are better to seek peace. As Rabbi Fleisher pointed out, the Al-Jabri clan is a clan that wants to work with us. And sometimes when we do this, when we do these kinds of things, so we end up putting them in a very, very precarious position. And
that's not what they say.
Right.
They're happy for us to build.
Each time it's a question of what the timing is, and more importantly, what the long-term goal is. I see the complexity of the issue. I don't have a real answer. Right. On one hand, a lot of things that happen in Israel happen because people engage in what we would call pirate activities. This is not a pirate activity. It's legally, feasible. But even if it's legally feasible, the question is now the right time to do it? When's the right time to do it? What's the best way to get to our goals? I firmly believe that Jews have the right to live anywhere they want in the land of Israel. At the same time, I also believe very strongly that we shouldn't be putting all the Palestinians into one group and assuming they're all jihadists or assuming they're all. And I think Rabbi Fleisher agrees with me. They're not all that way. All too often, we end up doing that. I remember sitting with a colleague of mine who is an imam following a horrific killing. He actually went in 2015 in Har Nof, where the terrorists went into a synagogue in Har Nof and killed.
And the four rabbis.
Right, the rabbis.
Yes,
right.
A terrible incident.
This imam came to me afterwards. He actually went to pay a bereavement call there.
Yeah.
And then he came to talk to me afterwards. And I said, tell me about your aspirations and your dreams. And he said, I dream of the day where he wears a long cloak, frock, if you will, as an imam. He said, I dream of the day when I get on the bus in Israel as a full Israeli citizen and people don't assume that under my frock I'm holding a suicide bomb. He said, everybody says, when I get on the bus, people just move away a little. He said, just for a second, they can move away a little. So that's also a day I dream of. I think as an Orthodox rabbi, I think that's a day that I pray for 3 times a day. And we're not there now. When we talk about the inhabitants of Judea and Samaria, and again, there's not one stripe and there's not one shade. There's many, many shades and stripes. I feel like sometimes things are done when there's opportunities to do them, even if they're not necessarily, or their approach is to say, we need to do this just to be able to get to this is the best way to get to the long-term goal. And sometimes I don't think that's the right way to go. I think, unfortunately, all too much in Israel, especially in my world as well, in the world of the Israeli rabbin and the religious establishment, there are often decisions that are taken on an ad hoc basis because there's an opportunity. And we take advantage of the opportunity, not thinking about the long-term implications,
consequences,
and the consequences, and that's a big concern for me.
But Rabbi Farber, you also said that for your organization, what you're doing, you sense that there's a revolutionary moment. You sense that this is the time to get things done, and you even admitted yourself you're not exactly sure what the consequences are of that, because you want to move forward in the time allotted to us by God in this great moment. And you and I both agree that the Jewish people went through the greatest tragedy and the greatest miracle. For us in Hebron, you're right, it's a time of opportunity. This building has been out of our possession for 100 years, since 1914, and we are now having the legal right to do it. And the folks that don't want us to build it are people who basically disagree with the very presence of Jewish people in Hebron, and that's just a cover because they really disagree with Jewish presence in the land of Israel in the end. And so our presence there ensures, and this is a statistic that you didn't mention, Paul, our presence in Hebron ensures that there's about 1.5 million visitors to the tombs of the fathers and mothers in Hebron yearly, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and others. And we are the ones that allow that to happen. The tomb of Joseph, where there's no Jewish presence and therefore no Israeli army presence, is a place that you cannot come to for prayer, for pilgrimage, or for visitation, because it is out of our control. And so Jewish presence in Hebron ensures safety, and I want to assure you that we are very much looking forward to an eye of a collegiate, friendly relationship with our Arab neighbors. And I am trying to speak right now with the UAE folks to see if we can come together and build a hotel in Hebron, which is going to be called the Abraham Hotel or the Ibrahimi Hotel, which is going to be an Arab-Jewish hotel that really will welcome peoples of all faiths to come under the wing of Abraham and the children of Abraham.
I'll be very interested to hear how that particular project goes. It sounds like an interesting development. We're running out of time. We've covered some very interesting issues. There's one story that I just want to come to, the final one that Rabbi Seth Farber wanted to mention. We'll have to keep this one fairly brief, I think, but it's to do with mikvot, the ritual baths here in Israel, which, of course, are a very important part of a Jewish society, particularly a religious Jewish society. And the fact that, as the Jerusalem Post report, according to Jeremy Sharon, their reporter, some 2/3 of them are unlicensed. And your organization, Rabbi Seth Farber, looking into this issue, because there are quite a number of problems with the fact that they are unlicensed, especially in these particular times.
Right. The story of the ritual baths is actually a great example of the intersection of Jewish religious life and democratic life, particularly in the era of Corona. Over 500,000 women visit the ritual baths in Israel each year, generally following their menstrual cycle, and that's part of a Jewish religious tradition. Mm-hmm. The question of how they're being supervised, they're all public institutions, the ritual baths, and they're actually paid for by public funds, by everybody's taxes in this country.
Right.
What we discovered at the beginning of Corona, at the beginning of the pandemic, was that the basic health requirements that are mandated by the government are not necessarily being implemented in all the ritual baths across the country. And worse than that, as we began to delve into it, and we got more than 400 complaints in the first 2 or 3 months of the pandemic, what we discovered is that over, as you said, over 70% of the mikvahs, which are built by public funds, are not licensed, which means that even if the government, even if the Ministry of Religious Affairs or the Health Ministry issues a directive that basic health concerns have to be implemented, they're not subject to any sort of oversight because they're not licensed.
Right.
We've taken this issue nationally just this week. Today is Thursday. On Monday, we had a hearing in the Knesset about it, and the Knesset has authorized the creation of an interministerial committee to look into this issue, to make sure that all the mikvahs are licensed, and more importantly, that women who use these mikvahs are protected, that the safety procedures are
the health and safety issues.
Exactly, health and safety issues. And this is a great example of how we can literally change things. Even in the time of a pandemic, we can change things for the long term. It's inexcusable that the government spends hundreds of millions of shekel on public institutions, and then they're not subject to any sort of oversight that would allow them to meet minimum standards. And that's something that ITIM is very proud of, that we've been able to change. We've been able to change in areas of burial, in areas of marriage, in areas of divorce, and now in areas of ritual baths. It sounds like a small thing, but when you think about the number of 500,000 women who basically don't know where, what it is that they're going into, that really changes, it changes things. And again, we want to move the goalposts. We want to make sure that from here on in, this will be resolved.
And some sort of proper oversight. Rabbi Yishai Fleisher in Hebron, any view or any point you'd like to raise on this particular question?
Our mikvaot are certainly with oversight, and they're properly kept. They're quite beautiful, and all the mikvaot that I've seen in Israel that I've seen are in good shape, and they have like all kinds of certification papers on them, and I certainly can understand what Rabbi Farber is talking about. Again, here, and it's fun to be with Rabbi Farber because you're really dealing with issues that I don't deal with. So just some thoughts. One of the things that I have come to appreciate in the ultra-Orthodox world, which I think is the world that sometimes Rabbi Farber is probably butting heads with a little bit, and trying to, shall we say, get into more, you call it democratic, but a more legal framework, a state framework. One of the things that I've come to appreciate really recently is that statism is good, and sometimes it brings law and order, but sometimes it brings with it a certain kind of mind control and a certain cultural control. And I understand today more and more why the ultra-Orthodox kind of chafe against being controlled by the state. And they're saying, listen, we want less interference by the state. We want more of our autonomous way to do our religious things. We want more autonomy in media. We want more autonomy in culture. We want more autonomy in public transportation, et cetera, et cetera. We want more space in our areas without your patrols and your things. And maybe we even want our own doctors to deal with COVID instead of your government doctors. And I used to always feel more like Rabbi Farber, I think, today, because I'm starting to be more concerned with cultural input by certain elites. I can understand that the ultra-Orthodox, who I am not a part of,
Yes.
and don't live their life, but I've come to appreciate that they exist in Israel as a tension against a certain kind of full status control, which we sometimes have a tendency towards. I would even say that in a weird way, their corporate but anti-state kind of attitude is in a sense kind of like the American small government conservative approach, which says government shouldn't get into my business too much. I totally understand the other side of what Rabbi Farber is saying, and I am not opining specifically on it. I'm just saying I understand today where people say, get out of my kishkas. If I want to put a hole in the ground and add water to it, and a woman wants to come in and use it, that's if it's not state money, of course. I can understand that's of course a caveat. If you are taking state money, then you're going to have to be put under the oath. That's clear.
Every citizen of the state has to be protected by the health and safety guidelines.
Yes and no, because the citizen is also an autonomous person who can make a decision. Meaning to say, if I want to, just one last point, if I want to go swimming in an area with no lifeguard, then maybe that's also my prerogative. And if I die, God forbid, that's also, in a sense, my prerogative. But on the other hand, a state can mandate a seatbelt and say, if you want to drive a car with everybody else, you have to wear a seatbelt.
But the argument about going... Sorry, I'll go to Rabbi Farber. But for the last word on this, because we're running out of time.
I would just say that we're a big advocate of trying to relax the government controls on all areas of Jewish life. We believe that there should be alternative channels, even for getting married in this country. The ultra-Orthodox should not have the singular right to have their exact stream of the way it is to get married, or the way it is to get buried, or the way it is to get divorced. We're big believers in that. That doesn't mean we don't think there should be a religious establishment. There should be, but it should allow different channels or different methodologies of approaching this. But in the meantime, while that isn't happening, and the government is controlling, and there is religious coercion in this country, it has to be done in a responsible way. It can't be done in a willy-nilly way that basically doesn't protect people and protect people's basic rights. So in this particular case of the mikvaot, of the ritual baths, it's a good example where literally hundreds of millions of shekel every year are going to public institutions that are not providing the kind of oversight that they ought to. And that's something, again, slowly we're changing, and changing in a lot of ways across the board, and this is just one of the things that ITIM does to try to make Israel a better place to live in.
Well, as you both said during the course of this conversation, and it's been a very interesting dialogue. Certainly I've enjoyed, and I'm sure our viewers have as well. This is an evolving project, and all these subjects are going to keep coming back in different forms, and we'll be visiting them along the line. I did want to ask you one or two other questions, but we have actually run out of time. So I'm going to thank you both very much indeed for what's been a really fascinating discussion. Rabbi Yishai Fleisher in Hebron and Rabbi Seth Farber from ITIM. Thank you very much to both of you for taking the time to join us. And of course, we'll be here next week with more discussion of what the Israeli papers say and the issues that really count here in Israel. But for now, from me, Paul Alster, I say goodbye and wish you all a very good weekend and a good Shabbos. Bye-bye for now.